Hey everyone, welcome back to the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Quick reminder to catch us on all your favorite podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. Happy holidays. We are heading into the holiday season, so I hope everybody is well and enjoying some much needed relaxation around this time of year. Guys, teeing this up, Lakshay, I'm going to start with you. Something that's been very popular in many news cycles is the alleged drone sightings in kind of the New Jersey area. As somebody who kind of is a recreational user of drones, would just be
Mhm.
curious to hear your thoughts on drones overall. Is this thing significantly overblown? Kind of where's this going?
Yeah, so I think as a hobbyist, a lot of people like flying drones in cities around nature, and I think especially over the last couple of years, restrictions have become really heavy, like really, really, really heavy. I think in some cases, rightfully so. The FAA, a lot of the regulations have to do with like crowding airspace. Like a lot of people like to fly drones really high up. You have to be worried about airplane landing zones, and if a drone, of course, gets in the way of an airplane, that can be like catastrophic. I think with what's happening most recently in New Jersey, I think the sightings are kind of a mix of what feels like some level of paranoia to me, but it's not too out of lane for what the FAA usually does. I think in general, like we're seeing like it's pretty hard to be a hobbyist with the drone, just in general, because that sort of toy, as we've seen, can be done very dirty effectively, where the sort of thing that you could buy at like a Costco or you could buy at like a Best Buy can be like weaponized really, really heavily. And again, it's not like most Americans are using it that way. But inevitably, when you have this sort of tool and you're seeing examples in media of how it's being used really, really nefariously, and it takes all of like a retail purchase to weaponize something like that. I think what's happening with the FAA is they were already pretty drone paranoid in general. What's happening worldwide is blasting that up a little bit. And so sightings of drones around New Jersey, even if it's just a recreational flyer wanting to just like take a cool shot of a building or a power plant, is all of a sudden just like this hobby's getting a little too large. Let's cool it off a little bit.
Yeah, I'm curious if you've got any response to kind of the paranoia that's surrounding these drones. Any thoughts on it? Do you think these are recreationalists' toys? Do you think these are kind of military exhibitions? Just curious as to where that's kind of landing on you.
I think could be. I mean, it's weird to me that's like being marked up as like a collection of sightings. Like I haven't looked into it enough to see like what is the actual frequency of like, oh, there's a lot of drones about. I don't think like flying drones is that common of a hobby that like people would make a whole thing out of like a season of drones being spotted, which to me suggests like it's probably something non-recreational in some capacity. Um, but I think like again, it's the sort of thing that like if it were recreational, the like react if even if the FAA knew it was recreational, I think that the reaction would be pretty similar. I think it wouldn't be that different. Of course, it's like it could be anyone and anybody flying that thing and just collecting information. Um, but the FAA in general, like this feels like something that would have come down the pipe anyway. You know, like in due time, I think like the idea of being able to fly a drone around the city goes away.
Yeah, understood. Understood. Out of curiosity, when you're flying recreational drones, like the brands that I'm aware of are like DJI and some others. I mean, is that kind of the still dominant player there?
Yeah, they're still recreational. I mean, like they also have like military contracts and all sorts of stuff. Like they are I think if you're like thinking about like active wars where we've seen drones being flown around, like a lot of those are DJI off the shelf purchases. Um and so like I mean you don't need a DJI one. Those are just like they're probably the most quality and like well reputed brand in general. Um which is it's a shame. I mean, like I think it's a cool hobby, and there's obviously a lot of like photography that's built around it, and like a lot of like Hollywood is benefiting from like cost cutting that drones can pull off, where you don't have to use like big crane operators and that sort of thing. And obviously, there's still places where like licenses of drones can still be used for filming and all that sort of stuff. But I think in general, I have found that as someone who likes the hobby, to use it legally, which a lot of people don't. You have to go through a lot more process for any one instance of flying a drone. Like the FAA basically has to know exactly what you're doing before you execute on it. Which probably, if you're flying above a power plant in New Jersey, they're probably paranoid about that a little bit. It's like, why the hell is someone doing that without knowing? And that is a flight risk at a fundamental level.
Yeah, understood. I think even beyond the recreational habit, I'm interested to see, especially as we move into 2025, what advances are made with drones and kind of autonomy in general. I think that we're seeing some, momentum into the robotic space, and as a consequence, that bleeds over into drones. We're seeing these drones used in various applications, including military, as you kind of alluded to. I'll be interested to see how that kind of plays out over the new year.
Yeah, I think with drones in general, it's just like I think in the context of like how we're seeing it being used in war, like the funny thing I guess is that like a drone is a relatively low cost financial object, but it's a very sufficient like payload carrier effectively. And um it's the sort of thing where like even if robotics doesn't progress super heavily, it's super high impact in general, right? Like one person can do a lot of damage with like 17 drones over the course of 1 hour. You don't need to have it like fully automated or fully intelligent to be doing a lot. And regardless, like DJI, all these companies, like when they're building drones, like these drones can like automatically follow, like automatically rotate around like known objects. Like their computer vision is really strong on like platform. So they're already quite capable as it is. So it'll be interesting. I mean, I think it's quite easy for robotics to progress in the drone sense because you're just dealing with a known like movement space. You know, you're not dealing with carrying objects or grasping things.
Yeah, and I wonder, kind of as an extension of that conversation, we're seeing kind of robotics manufacturers not in the drone space, namely Figure, beginning to launch levels
Mm.
of kind of humanoid robots. Tesla obviously has their project that they're working on, and so I'm curious how you think that extends into that world. Figure just announced recently that they are officially revenue generating, which is obviously kind of a big milestone for that company. I don't think there were claims as to how many, but the essence is that they are actually shipping these humanoid robots, to commercial partners. So curious how
Did
you're
they
reacting to that.
say I saw that there was a commercial sale on Twitter. Did they say like who the buyer was or what they were trying to do
Not
with
that I've
it?
seen. I know based on other reports that automakers, specifically BMW, have been testing, doing kind of proof of concept, pilots, if you want to call them that, with Figure. But I don't know who currently is paying for kind of this, round of shipment. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting in general what we've seen going on with robotics, where like at least in like demo, like at least in video, it seems sufficient at like some basic tasks, and obviously like it seems like Tesla is promoting the usage of their tool internally in like factory settings. It doesn't feel to me like it's functional yet, and I have to imagine that like the price of one of these things is pretty close to a salary, or at least is like on the order of magnitude of a salary anyway. So I do wonder like how it's actually making a delta for a company, like where it's currently being used. I don't have a proper sense of like where it's like replacing a person to do a job.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know, like they've not released the price points to the public. I'm sure that there are, various price points they're trying to optimize for and work out. I mean, I think the advantage, right, is even if you are paying the equivalent of a human salary, you're getting kind of 24/7 labor. They don't need breaks, they don't need those kind of things. So there's some efficiency gains even on a dollar per dollar basis, but I think time will tell, right? I know that Tesla has come out and said that somewhere in the $20,000 to $30,000 price range is achievable, possibly even going lower into the consumer kind of regime. But I think TBD on kind of that. Josh, I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on kind of drones segueing into autonomy, and then also Figures kind of rollout of their autonomous robots?
Mark Andreessen in 2011 said that software is eating the world. And if you expand software to tech, this feels like tech eating military, tech eating surveillance. And so let's go to what's been said. Biden made a statement saying there's nothing anomalous, there's no national security concern or public safety risk, essentially. And then John Kirby, who's a national security spokesperson, said, reiterated that this is just a combination of lawful commercial drones, hobbyist drones, and law enforcement drones. What that suggests to me is we live in an age where we have satellites to watch everything. That surveillance capability is real time. It's ubiquitous. If something was flying into our airspace, we would know it. We would be very much on top of that. And the United States happens to be separated by oceans from from countries that we would consider to be potentially competitive or hostile. Canada and Mexico are not zones that we would worry about from a military perspective. So we would have lots of warning as drones would progress over oceans. And so that tells me that we know what these are, that they are probably law enforcement related, and could be new law enforcement monitoring systems or something like that. But this is another step toward tech is eating the world.
Do you think we're going to see, especially given the kind of proliferation of the humanoid robot from Figure and Tesla and others, do you think in 2025, asking to speculate a little bit here, you think we're going to see more of these things, more of these companies kind of coming to market, more of these things coming out into the world, kind of beyond drones?
We've seen a shift in the zeitgeist from everything AI to now AI plus robotics as more topical in tech. And so what have we seen? We've seen lots of projects get funded, and those projects are going to come online. They're going to try lots of things. Many of them will fail. Right, like that's sort of the nature of tech investing, tech development is you invest in lots of them, many fail, a few become big winners, and those create some kind of change, whether it's incremental or more significant change, from delivery robots to home care to industrial cleanup situations. There are all kinds of robotics based projects. I would expect even more to come online in 2025, and I could see more making a material impact, whether that's for human safety or for cost reduction, where it's perhaps very expensive to get human labor to do something, but much cheaper to get robots to do it.
Yeah,
I
I
think
will
as
say just like a scientific, sorry to interrupt. I will say at least at like a scientific level, it is really interesting. I think we've talked about like data plateaus and in general what has happened with like data availability and like AI progress. It is pretty interesting to me how it seems like a growing paradigm for teaching robotics is literally just like have a person have like a little claw tool and like mimic the action you need to take to train the robot to do the thing it should do, like make a coffee or open up a package. Um, I think it's interesting. I think especially in the robotics case where we haven't seen computer vision progress too much in like the last couple of years. Like a lot of the hype of the last couple of years has been very like text generation focused. That's where all this hype about reasoning is coming from. Like, oh, we're gonna unlock like intelligence that way. But we haven't really considered, I think, as like a at least in like tech leadership, people aren't really talking about like AGI and what that means for like a machine that can do things and what the visual piece of that looks like. Um, I think like it's at least interesting. I think to like speculate on like what is the bottleneck there. Of course, it's always going to be the data, but it's a lot harsher, right? Where like action data is something that's almost completely absent from the world. I don't think many companies are collecting like it's not like your Apple Watch knows like what you're doing with two hands, right? Um, that I think like it'll be interesting to see where how far Figure and these other companies can go to making practical use cases work when data is so limited. You know, like maybe you train off YouTube videos, but how many of them are from like an angle that like a drone or a robot knows to be able to look through, for example, right?
It's not obvious to me that the mapping from watching video to taking physical action for robotics training will work. In fact, I would expect it probably to not work very well. Um, Physics is a core problem and something that we've seen other AI systems. I mean, Sora is an obvious example. Have you seen the latest Sora videos? Like they're just bad. Like they just don't get physics in a very basic way. Um, um, I would think in robotics, physics becomes the kind of the most important piece. If you can start with understanding the physical world and gravity and how things operate, then you can kind of build up to taking action in that world. I don't think video training, like I've heard of several of these companies doing video based training, and I just don't think that that's going to be as fruitful as if you had a half humanoid suit, for example, with sensors, and the robot kind of saw all of the actions and the kind of when you move with and against gravity, to take action, and then kind of do that without the human inside the suit. Kind of. structure, I think that would probably, my instinct is that's going to work better.
Yeah, at least I think in like what's become at least relatively more common. I think in the robotic space, like they rely a lot on like physics simulators. So you'll have like a digital reconstruction of this robot. Like it has the same actuators, the same like sensitivities in the same positions, and like its 3D replication. Like the goal is that these physics simulators are like as close to real world as possible. But there's a whole domain of science we haven't yet solved to like get that part right. Right. Like I think it's going to be a very, very, very long time before a robot figures out how to squeeze a tube of toothpaste and put it on a toothbrush well, right? Like that's such a like a to us, it's just like, oh yeah, you just squeeze and you feel it out, and it's just like a little bit of toothpaste comes out. But there's so much like if you think about just like fundamental intricacy about like how do fluid dynamics work, like visually, like what's the toothpaste tube shape to be able to get that to work. Um, and physics, we aren't even to like able to replicate like that fundamental level. In some cases, like in animation and Hollywood, we're able to get it to look correct. But even that's like with digital trickery, right? It's not the same thing as like fundamentally having Newtonian physics replicated across the spectrum of a 3D compute space.
I think the interesting piece of this for me is that my belief in why we've seen autonomous driving come so far is because Tesla was able, through kind of offering a traditional service a la manual driving, get a lot of sensors on the road that was able to then train these systems via computer vision. With the humanoid robot, the challenge to me seems that there is no market for a robot that isn't very good yet, meaning that in the car space, there was still a market for cars that had to be driven by humans before the autonomous car was very good. And in that paradigm, Tesla was able to get a lot of sensors on the road, get a lot of cars that were able to create input engines for their kind of computer vision machine learning algorithms. I don't see a similar paradigm being able to be played in the humanoid robot space. And therefore, it feels to me like the kind of the learning curve, if you will, for how long it's going to take for us to get a successful humanoid robot out into the world is going to be longer. I don't know how much longer, but to the point both of you are making, I just don't see a natural entry point for learning at scale like there has been with the autonomous driving. And to the point on trying to model physics, those are some of the largest challenges we have. I mean, I think we're probably waiting on some level of breakthrough for quantum computing and able to model even just Newtonian fluids like you alluded to. Well, actually, those are very, very hard problems. I think the things that are particularly interesting, we talked about this on the podcast a number of times, these some of these diffusion models, Sora, the new video models from Google, et cetera, they don't discretely model physics. They simply just kind of go, they kind of infer physics based on kind of the overall training. And so I still think there's some chance that you get around the need to accurately model physics. But I don't know how that plays out in the physical world and on what time scale. It feels to me like we are probably further than we are closer to that.
Yeah, I will say, as someone who's not like, I'm not a person who's like building models all the time, but like obviously in the space we're in, like I see opinions from a lot of people are building models all the time, where it seems to me like the general sentiment used to be like, okay, we're going to unlock models. So this applies to anything. This applies to text, it applies to robotics, applies to vision, whatever have you. We have beginning model. We have models that are generation focused. That creates our synthetic data, and the synthetic data allows us to like unlock the model to like its like full capacity. I think in general, like that was part of like if you look at like what the general hype curve is, I think what we're finding right now is that the synthetic data isn't good enough for that big model unlock that everyone was really hoping it would be. So for example, I mean, like in the Sora case, like most obviously, like yes, Sora, like it does a good video sometimes. Like the synthetic data is like probably in some cases useful, but like to put it in a robotic sim, right? Like that's another couple years of work to make a Sora video actually useful for physics, right? At which point it's no longer synthetic data; it's manually label, like reconstruct, add vectors, and make it make much more physical sense than we can from just a video. I think in general, like we're seeing in the space where data continues to be a problem. I think robotics there are probably some clever things you could get away with to like make robotics data more useful, especially since we've seen that some of the best data that's being collected is just people walking around with objects that have motion capture on them. Um, I imagine there's some clever stuff you could do with like worker exoskeletons or even VR and those neural interfaces where they're able to track hand gestures and motions in camera. But none of those have a killer use case that allows them to be widespread and farming up data yet. Like all of those are cool, like pony tricks that exist somewhere in tech, but they're not being purchased by anyone, so the data feed isn't worth anything.
I wonder if
I
we're
think
going
we
about
alluded
this the
to it a
wrong
couple
way.
times there, but Lakshay, I'd just like to get your thoughts transitioning a little bit into the newest releases from Google.
Mm-hmm.
So, Lakshay, or Shashi, you kind of alluded to it. The Sora model, which had been the previous state of the art in generative video AI, has kind of now been, at least based on kind of the available demos and previews, kind of overtaken by Google. And I think there's some interesting ideas there around Google's access to YouTube videos and their ability to then train video AI on top of that kind of enriched kind of data source. If you will, but actually, I'm curious. We've seen a lot of recent releases from Google. How are they landing on you, video model and otherwise?
I think it's I think it's cool to see this much activity from Google. I think their models are competitive. I think the challenge that exists for any of these companies is the product and the market reach problem. I think the Google models and the stuff that they've shown is actually pretty impressive. Like they have a lot of state of the art models that are available for free. Of course, they have the monopoly configuration to be able to support that sort of stuff, and a lot of it's like pretty developer friendly. Like there, I know there's a voice model that came out. I've yet to try it, but it's like it is very state of the art, and developers can use it up to like 1,000 credits of it for free compared to OpenAI, where like all this sort of stuff is still pretty premium in nature. I think with I think even like as OpenAI, like they're doing this whole like 12 days of Christmas stuff. I don't think we're seeing as much model progress this kind of season from OpenAI. Like the O1 was cool. It to me feels like they are trying to hack product right now. Like they're trying to get ChatGPT into as many people's hands as possible right now. And it feels to me like Sora was a cool demo to them, maybe, but like even in use cases, like it feels like they're still kind of feeling it out, and that's leading to a lot of competitors being like, "Wait, that's smart. Let's crush it." The main competitor being Google.
I think it's
Shashi, and
awesome
you.
to see Google release, push product out into the world, and I'm glad that they're not so worried about reputation that they're hedging and waiting
Mm-hmm.
and taking too long to release product. So I think that's great, and there's lots of really great work being done by teams at Google that are now kind of finding the light of day. That there's the Willow quantum computing processor that was announced recently. Notebook LM is looking really good, and a variety of other things getting released. So I think it's great that they're releasing. I think Google is reestablishing its culture of innovation rather than. I think many people would probably attest that Google has been fairly fat and lazy as a company for the last 5 to 10 years. They've had kind of easy growth come from ad revenue on Google.com, and YouTube has been kind of a quietly monopolistically growing dominant platform in their space. And so that's created kind of a tailwind that allowed a lot of people to be kind of fat and lazy and get paychecks to sit on lawn chairs and such. But it's great to see this shift in culture come from Google. I hope it continues. I hope they keep taking chances and trying. The one complaint I have is that I think they're trying to monetize too strongly. If I were them, I would be giving Gemini away basically for free, unless you're kind of an enterprise user. I think the game for Google is actually market share and not profit. I think they're aiming too much for profit, and it's probably their internal dynamics of how teams get assessed and measured. How do managers get measured internally? I would pull the control out of the CFO's hands. Look, when the finance people come into a big company, everything goes to shit, right? Like that's like the nature of it is if the CFO is the most powerful voice in the room, the company has no product culture. That's like sort of the natural course of things. What they need to do is reduce the role of the CFO and increase the role of product people in the company. That's what Elon always does in a company. He gets the kind of the DEI thing out of the way. He gets the CFO's voice out of the way. He says, let's build great product. And what you find is like that's an investment in your customer. It's an investment in quality and taking all the like optics stuff out of the way, taking all of the like financial squeeze a penny here and penny there out of the way, and it just focuses on velocity. Velocity is the coin of the realm right now. If you have velocity, especially with product velocity, you're going to build a great ethos and a great company. And if you reduce that velocity to optimize for something else, whether that's finance or otherwise, you're just going to be someone that's left behind. So it's hopeful for Google. I hope they can reduce their financial mindset and increase their product and product velocity mindset.
Out of curiosity, when you say give Google away for, or not Google, geez, when you say
Gemini.
give Gemini, are you saying on the developer level? Are you saying on the consumer level, just across the board? Like, what level do you think they're not doing a good job of giving their tools out?
This is an early, like when you look at an early nebulous market, it's all about market share. Right? This is not a play for profit. They should, if they're playing for profit now, I'd say it's just it's a complete misread of the market. The market is formative. Like for example, we saw how much attention Claude got when Sonnet 3.5, whatever the second version of 3.5, whatever came out, and Claude Sonnet's really good, and we saw a lot of people in the developer community and otherwise shift over to saying this is a great model. I'm going to be using this now rather than ChatGPT. There's just so much opportunity for people to switch. If Gemini, I mean, tell me this: if Gemini came out with the very best model tomorrow and it was free, would you use Gemini or would you use Anthropic or would you use ChatGPT?
Well, actually, for the longest time, Gemini has boasted that like 1 million context window model, and they're the first to get there. And like I found like I don't know, proving a 1 million context model thing is like its own problem, I guess. But I didn't move to Gemini because of its price. I stayed
Exactly.
on Anthropic and I stayed on ChatGPT because like I was like, this is like insane cost. Why would I ever use this? So I just went on off and hacked it with a cheaper model effectively. I do think, at least at like a product level, what I don't understand, to be honest, is why Google hasn't just like pushed more on making. I feel like they could very, very quickly crush a ChatGPT or a Perplexity or a Claude if they just took their traditional search UI and didn't make the AI generated thing feel super secondary. Right now, like there are definitely a lot of people who get like straight answers out of like the Gemini completions or whatever on like, here's my search result. Here's like a little box at the top that describes the general summary of it. Sometimes get stuff wrong. And then you get to the traditional list. I think there is like a better UI possibly that feels like just like, why would I ever use ChatGPT? Why would I ever use Perplexity? Why would I ever use Claude? And you get the natural consumer to instead start thinking like, oh, this ChatGPT thing is just like a Google ripoff. Or like this Perplexity thing is just a Google ripoff. Like Google already does this. What's the value of this product? And Google gives it to me for free. I don't know why they haven't done that. Obviously, their search bar is very, very identifying and very important to them. But it does feel to me like the way that they've implemented it is just like 2 or 3 iterations away from actually like being a significant blow to distribution to most of these other companies.
Yeah, and I think the right way for Google to approach this is to what they're here's what they're worried about, Lakshay. What they're worried about is your mom, your grandma, who are
Mhm.
accustomed now to using Google.com and knowing what it does and how it does it, to go do a search and get something unexpected and they get confused. That's what they're trying to avoid. The way to do that is to create a second interface or to create a settings button where you can select your interface style and maybe you want interface number 2 or number 3, whatever they want to publish. And then what they need to do is be really innovative and take market share on those and promote that to perhaps a younger audience who's more open and keen to use something like that. I would absolutely do what you're saying, but I think they have to do it in a way that doesn't, by default, alienate their non-tech customers who won't switch with them.
Mm. Yeah, I think I don't know, it just feels so like I think like Notebook LM, like the UI for that thing is really, really good. I think like Notebook LM is like fairly well designed and clearly Google's recognizing that and like doubling down on that as an AI product. Um, Especially like when that whole like podcast trend happened where it's like make a podcast on any topic, and Notebook LM was the way to do that. I think Google kind of recognized that they were sitting on something fairly unique. I think it's just that we're in tech. We hear about these things all the time. We know about like, oh, here's like clever UI or this clever product implementation that exists. But until like until it feels like Google as like a product analytics team is like leaking out new UI to like even 5% of users and seeing what works, and like, okay, 5% of users are really liking it, let's bump it up to 7, now to 10, to 15, whatever have you. It just feels like they're like giving up relatively free ground given how much love there is for like Search GPT, Perplexity. Claude doesn't have web browsing yet, but even just like the native abilities of Claude. Um, and the sooner they can psychologically push that to mainstream, I imagine like competition becomes really, really, really difficult for most of these companies, like supremely uphill.
And the only small tweak to make that happen is to stop trying to monetize and optimize financially and instead optimize on market share. If they just made that internal dynamic shift, it would have almost no effect, no negative effect on their corporate financials. Their corporate financials will basically be the same, right? How much impact does Gemini have on their corporate financials? I mean, it's essentially zero. So why not optimize for market share? Measure your managers on market share. Don't measure them on financials, and just grab as much turf as possible in this new frontier instead of trying to make money on it right now.
I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate to that argument because I think that Google currently, and if I were role playing Google in this conversation, my retort to Lakshay specifically of that is kind of the classic innovator's dilemma, in that fundamentally what them rolling out a great AI product does is potentially nerf their core business, which is search advertising. Right. And so my guess is that internally they're dealing with the conflict of how do we do AI the best in this new AI world without giving up the kind of golden goose that is search ads business. And so I think that you're right, Shashi, in the context of Gemini solely. Gemini can be a loss leader. It's okay if they're burning through token costs. They're already taking a large loss on the training of their AI models. To me, it feels like the internal conundrum is how does Google reconcile the legacy business that is still kind of the world's greatest cash cow, very high margin search advertising, in a new world in where instead of providing blue links that Google gets paid for, they have to provide answers that direct people not to the source material, but to actually then leaving their service and going off and doing kind of whatever actionable insights just came from those results. And so I guess I'm curious, maybe Lakshay, I'll start with you. How do you see those two things reconciling, if at all, right? How do they release a new product that effectively cannibalizes their core search product, even if in doing so they win, the AI battle over OpenAI or Anthropic, et cetera?
I do think that the dialogue, because we've had like a similar talk about like what ads and LLMs kind of looks like. I think like it would have been like maybe even a year ago that we started kind of talking about that thing, where I think the dialogue has kind of shifted, where there's like beginning hints of people being comfortable at like the business level, not necessarily at consumer, but just like people making more and more compromises to say like LMs are expensive, I'm going to put ads in mine. Obviously, like the way Google executes ads and that whole industry runs is much more complicated than just give me a link. Like you have to care about where people land and tracking attribution and what like embedded UIs people are interacting with. But I do think that if they really, really cared about protecting that, I do think that they could begin to put ads in an LLM and it would work. I think that they're relatively in position to like, if I look for like best holiday gifts this season and they showed me a paid for website, I don't think too many people would balk at that in the modern day. Um, where like, yes, like you lose people, like the thing people are paying for is for people to like click and read on the ad. But if you're showing an LM generated result and like you're giving a summary and the way it's integrated is to say like, oh yeah, like here are 12 results. You can go click on these affiliate links from this website. you can still kind of give people ad credit in a way. It's a little bit more complicated, but it doesn't feel far fetched to me to say that like people would be relatively okay with Google showing them an ad in an LLM, and you could still get mileage out of that.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think one follow-up question there, because I agree with most of what you said, is in the context of I'm already shopping for things, ad makes a lot of sense. It's not inherently distracting. It's directly in the flow of my large language model conversation. But in the context of non-e-commerce, in the way that the internet works traditionally right now, right? Like if I'm looking for the global effects of climate change as an example on weather conditions in the East Coast of the United States, as an example, I'm still going to land on either scientific or news related articles of those things. All the while being served relevant ads to my search history, right? I'm going to get golf clubs or whatever, right, exists in that, which is completely um, not topical to the thing that I'm actually looking for, but still allows Google to serve ad. And that to me is where I'm yet to reconcile how that paradigm works in the kind of sequential nature of these large language model search results. So any thoughts on that?
I think what the problem of what LMs do is that they take away the need to like jump through things to find a lot of material. I think that's like the kind of thing you're describing, like the like yeah, like I'm looking at weather and I'm seeing ads for golf. Like that's really unlikely to happen. But I think you kind of have to accept that if people are going to popularize these systems and like stick with them, that is going to go away. I feel like if you're a big company, you're better off like accepting that like market distribution is to your benefit right now, especially if you're farming up data that can at least teach you how to do the next thing. Because that's like a relatively unsolvable problem. Like that's an issue of incumbency, right? Um, but if you wanted to, I think the question of like what people do with LM user data, like the possibility of collecting a lot more rigorous data in general is much more prevalent, right? Like there's so much more that you can intuit about who a person is from like a conversational prompt with them than just simple keywords and like search history. And I think in trying to navigate how do I serve product, like basically purchasing opportunities to people, um, you're assuming that the system, I think that looks that what happens in like cyberpunk worlds effectively is that like as you're existing in the universe, like it's the same thing as like agents taking actions. It's just that actions are brought to you, right? Like if I'm like reaching lunchtime and I'm going about my workday, like maybe a nearby coffee shop can pop an ad into my little holodeck visor or something, right? It's no longer that I'm going out and seeking information. Information's brought to me. And that sort of way, you kind of have to assume that you're presenting ad style information to people. If you own the interface where people are just generally collecting information, that's a lot easier to do in a future time. But if you don't own the interface and you lose the market share of it, then you've lost the opportunity entirely.
I think it's well stated to say that the person or the entity, rather, the company that has the most enriched user data will ultimately
Mhm.
be able to execute against the ads based kind of revenue model the best. And if you own the interface, you'll have the opportunity to do that. And therefore, it's in Google's best interest, even if it does cannibalize some of its core business to do that. Josh, I want to kick it to you. Any response to this kind of entirely? How do you, in your words, kind of give away Gemini without hurting Google's core business and otherwise?
It's exactly how Perplexity would build their interface. You give away the search, you put ads up. It seems like a very neat, easy transition. It just expands the surface area for their search product, their core search product, and gives you more surface area to offer advertising. This is an eyeballs game. This is an audience game. And they're missing the obvious opportunity right in front of them to expand their surface area.
Out of
Out of
curiosity,
curiosity, oh, go ahead.
go ahead. Well, I was going to say, I think the that statement kind of alludes to what I think may be the next interface, and we've seen flashes of this already, and that is voice. And so I'm curious, just throwing it back to you, Shashi, do you see that kind of naturally being extended to things like the new 1-800 Chat GPT number and those kind of things? Like, do you see voice as kind of this next frontier and also an additional surface area opportunity?
I think they're gimmicks. I think 1-800 ChatGPT is a gimmick. Voice, I don't see most people using voice as their primary interface method. It's very much going to be secondary in my expectation, because any detailed information, you're going to want to see it with your eyes. You're not going to want to hear detailed information at length. So I think it's a nice to have. It's a small, tiny little side add-on for novelty, for content. It's not the real core of the product.
I'd argue just from my own experience where I think it's sometimes what I've done is that like if I'm on a long drive or something, obviously that some of this is biased by like the sort of setting I'm in, but like where I can't have like eyes on something else that's not the road. Like if there's something I'm like thinking about or like trying to like analyze or just like process for myself, like what I've done is I've popped open ChatGPT voice mode and just like had a full on conversation with it. Just like, hey, like explain to me this thing, like help me work through this thing, blah, blah, blah. And I think especially if they put search in it, which it seems like is coming really, really soon, that would be quite significant. I think like you have to train a user behavior there, but especially for a lot of the world that is mobile first, obviously in like Western spaces, like we're used to working off laptops and working wherever, but a lot of like Asia, a lot of Africa, South America is mobile first. I think by putting a WhatsApp tool up and by putting a phone number up, um, if they can figure out a right use case that feels like it has a lot of potential to be a viral thing in my I like concept. I don't think it's there yet. I don't think a lot of people have the thing that's just like, I'm gonna go use voice mode for this thing. But in the same way as like Notebook LLM, like there it just takes like one killer use case for people to suddenly converge on that thing. I'm
Thinking of
eager for
something
it.
like? Are you
Go
thinking
ahead.
of something like the movie Her, like that kind of voice interaction continually?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I just like I like the way I use it is like as a thought partner when I'm like driving, where it's just like I have like this thing like that's like bugging me, or I need a problem solve for this thing, so I use it to like play ideas back or explain something to me or like help me work through like okay, like there's some math I have in my head about like this thing I need to figure out, like help me work through the calculations here. Why did you use this like factor or whatever? Even like financial stuff sometimes, where it's just like explain like this breakdown for me. Um, I think like having an omnipresent voice is a very different unlock from like something you have to manually call and get a reaction from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but I do think that like by putting it into more mobile first interfaces, there's the possibility for a really cool discovered use case, I think.
Yeah, I also wonder, and I think this is a great place to close, is that as agents become more and more capable and the paradigm shifts to kind of running in front of you to running in the background, completing kind of longer, more time to complete tasks, if voice becomes a prominent interface there. I don't know that I have a very strong opinion on voice. We've seen the prevalence of like Amazon Echo devices as an example in the homes have some levels of success. We've seen even in our customer testing, well, actually, that a lot of people are interacting with ChatGPT via the voice mode. So I think there's some interesting things there. I think to Shashi's point, it's yet to be determined how much that will play out and what kind of fraction of usership voice kind of proliferates into. But very interesting things. So thanks everyone for joining us for this week's episode of the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Remind us to catch us next week on some upcoming episodes. Check us out on your typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. Happy holidays and see you all next time.
Not a little,